All right, so we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday. For some of you, you folks will be having a holiday tomorrow, right? But for some of us, we still will be working tomorrow. But for those of you who do have a holiday tomorrow, hope you have a good long weekend. But for that, today I wanted to discuss a few things. And one of the things that I wanted to briefly mention before we get into the topic of today's office hours, which is updated best practices and workflow um, idealistic timelines, is our wiki site and where the resources are for these recordings, because we often get questions. So if we navigate from the homepage on the wiki site, we go over to resources and tools. Then if you scroll down, you're able to see downloadable form templates, how-tos, or just general how-tos. And then right down here, newsletters and recordings. So if you click on this link, you'll be able to see all the latest newsletters. But if you click on this link, this is where we have all of the past office hours training videos, so that you'll be able to go back and access and be able to see. And if you needed to access them again, you can go back at a slower pace if needed. And if you need to reference it, they're all here. So just wanted to briefly mention that. Secondly, if you go under the construction tab and you go under the construction phase, what I'm going to be talking about today is project diaries. So to access the portion of the wiki site that has the best practices for project diaries, click on this here. Now, this best practice was created about a year, 2 years ago. We compiled everything together when we were updating the wiki site. And it just briefly goes through some of the best practices for daily diaries, for inspectors, for field engineers, so on and so forth. Today, I really wanted to highlight some of the updated best practices, because these best practices are from a little bit ago. We updated them a little bit, but these are still from a little bit ago. So we have best practices for a workable day, and then we have best practices for unworkable day. I won't go into the detail of those old best practices, but they are available for you here. Additionally, we had about a year, 2 years ago, there was training specifically on JC cards, and even more recently, we went over best practices for material submission and JC card submission. So just a few best practices for daily diaries was here about a year, 2 years ago. And then finally, back to the original training, which is the CA 106, which will go over two parts. These are obviously from 4 to 5 years ago. And these were comprehensive trainings that went over diaries as a whole and then referenced the specifications and why it's important. So I will not be going over necessarily all of that today. We have resources available on the wiki site if you wanted to go back and take a look at that. What I will be going over today is some of the updated best practices. So as we've been utilizing the Headlight progress payment, and as JC cards came into the picture here as payments and change orders have come into the Headlight system, obviously there are best practices that will come along with that. And as somebody who is going through and making progress payments currently on a couple of projects, figured it would be a good idea to share some of the best practices that make it easier as an engineer or as a PM. If the diaries were laid out in a certain way and organized with certain information at the very start of when a diary is being created, it makes it easier. Later on down the line, I hope that there isn't any litigation, but if there later down the line, uh, this daily documentation will be of the utmost importance. And then just additionally, in order for any payment to be justified, the diary information needs to line up with it. And if the diaries are lined up a certain way, then obviously there will be less calculation, a justification that you'll need to do. You'll be able to directly take it from the diaries, and so on and so forth. So it all starts with the diaries. It all obviously starts with, capturing what was done on that day by the contractor. Right now, I'm in the Kauai Viaduct project, and this is just a test environment where I just made a few observations. Now, as you know, there are two specific modules that we are using when we're creating diaries. The first is spreadsheets, and spreadsheets is obviously ever since progress payments came along, this has been even more important, because obviously if you do not input the payment information here, you will not be able to make a payment in the Headlight progress payment. So making sure that whatever's worked on by the contractor corresponds to obviously a pay item. Some work is incidental, and what you can do there is you can write that in your notes if you had any questions, or account for that in the journal. But for any contract work or extra work, even the pay item should show up here as well if you've inputted your change order correctly. We have to make sure that as we're doing these diaries, we're notating the pay item down here with the author or with the quantity, and this is the authorized quantity, just to give you a better picture. And sometimes if you've set up the project initially correctly, if you go through and tag a pay item, then it will automatically tag a contractor associated with. Obviously, it all falls under the prime contractor, but the subcontractors do various work. So sometimes the subcontractor pay items will be connected to a subcontractor. And I just want to make sure that the theme throughout the entire best practice for this morning is we're making sure we're not leaving stuff blank. So from Kokua's, we've seen that some people would be entering spreadsheet information, like they'd enter a pay item here. They wouldn't enter a quantity, and they would not enter the contractor who worked on it, and they would not enter in any notes. And a lot of times what happens is you're left with some pictures in the journals. You're left with some pictures, but then even more so, this area is left blank as well. So I will go over that when I go over journals. But getting back to spreadsheets, what's important is we label for all the work that's done, we label a pay item that's associated with that work. We enter a quantity, and we understand that lump sum items can be a little bit difficult to quantify how much quantity was done for that day. So for lump sum items, obviously we've talked about this before, but for lump sum items, the engineers at the end of the month will be able to go and create a quantity adjustment that they'll be able to input the lump sum amount in its exact entirety of what was agreed to in the schedule of values. So, but nonetheless, it is still important for those who are doing diaries to input the pay item, even if it's lump sum, to note that that work was done for today, and to also provide notes here clarifying what was done. Because obviously you have lump sum items that get broken down from the schedule of value, and some of them are, more easily distinguishable at the end of the month, like for example, traffic control, where you're paid, an installation fee, or you're paying them or BMPs, where you're paying them to install different phases, complete different phases. And then you have a monthly maintenance fee. So a lot of those things are done at the end of the month by the engineer and decided at the schedule of value point. But there are some lump sum items where it's broken down into, it shows lump sum on the contract, but then it's broken down into a unit price, linear feet, cubic yard, square yard, so on and so forth. So again, even if it does say lump sum on the contract item, it is important that as we're creating these diaries, we're notating the pay items. And even if it's lump sum, you can keep the quantity 0 because technically the lump sum item is not tracking a unit cost that would show up correctly here. It'll say LS and then it'll give you a unit price of 1. You can make note of that here. So that is one of the best practices that we were seeing. People are notating lump sum items, yet they are not entering in the notes here. They're seeing that there's a unit price of 1, and they are not entering in any notes here to help the quantity adjustment at the end of the month. So overall, making sure that any work is being tracked needs to be corresponded to a pay item. So it needs to be notated down here, and we need to be filling out all of the applicable fields here. And in most cases, all of the fields are applicable. The quantity, pay item, the contractor who did the work. Obviously, in most cases, it's the prime contractor, but so subcontractor work is important to note that down here. And then obviously putting in the notes here, we've seen a lot of dimensions put here. We've seen a lot of what's really important and what would help an engineer here at the end of the month is if you are putting as an inspector or as a field engineer, putting your dimensions, putting your assumptions. Obviously it's very hard to capture exact quantities out in the field. So, but in order to make it easier at the end of the month and make it easier when you're doing payments and when you're negotiating at the end of the month as an engineer, is if you're an inspector or field engineer, under the notes section here, put the assumptions of the calculation. Because obviously, we're not going to be able to process a payment if we don't have that justification of providing the assumptions, providing your calc check. We won't be able to process a payment. So as an inspector or field engineer, when you're making these assumptions for your calculations, it's extremely helpful if you note down your assumptions for your calculation here. So obviously stationing, obviously, height, width, depth, all of those assumptions, especially for cubic yards, it is extremely helpful when you notate all of your assumptions here so that we don't have to guess, we don't have to go back, we don't have to go back necessarily and always, have to find the idealistic, the sheet where it applies. Obviously, we're looking at the sheet, to make sure that it was built in compliance, but it helps. And we understand that these always will not necessarily be absolutely 100% correct, that there is a little bit of room for error here, but it helps here. And one of the best practices I did want to highlight today is making sure that all pay items are tracked here, and then also making sure that you provide any notes for the pay items, especially for lump sum, but then especially for those cubic yard, for the square yard unit price calculations. So I've talked enough about pay items. That was the one I wanted to highlight here today. But labor, obviously super, super important. We go back, we verify these, through certified payroll, through if there are change orders that happen, obviously the contractor needs to provide backup documentation. So we need to, on the personnel. So all of this information, will be tracked here, and it's important that anyone on site is being tracked here in this labor section. What we've seen is where it happens like this, where this person's name gets entered. Sometimes there's a typo, but we want to make sure that we use the pre-selected ones at the beginning of the project. That's why we did best practice about 2 months ago, where we went over setting up the best practice for creating tags so that it's already here. And this person, Babe Ruth, is not associated with a contractor, but if you set up your project correctly per the best practice, you set up this person, they automatically correspond with the contractor. You won't need to enter this contractor here. And then you give them the controlling pay item for what they worked on that day. Again, it's something that wasn't required per se before, but this is something that makes it extremely helpful when we're going back at the end of the month to look at the progress payments, to negotiate, to see what was worked on, by whom, when, and how many hours, how many overtime hours, especially the classification. Again, a lot of times when we were going through some of the project diaries, these things were filled out, but the straight hours were not filled out or the classification was not filled out. So we need to make sure that, especially with certified payroll reviews, if this labor classification is not filled out, it's a problem. We need to verify the classification so that we can verify the certified payroll. And also, like I said, if there, there will be a time where change orders happen and the backup documentation like this will be extremely helpful. Similarly, equipment, it's the same thing as labor. Want to make sure that we have a controlling pay item for what was worked on for that equipment. Also the contractor operating hour, standby hour. A lot of times this can be seen as not important at the time of when you are making this observation, but it's very, very important because when we get into changes and claims, the contractor is going to claim for operating hours and standby hours, two different costs. Even if you see them not using that equipment directly with the controlling pay item, it's important we understand the equipment that is on site on standby, because that will then take effect into the cost of the change. So we need to be sure that we are tracking all of this information, not just one portion of it. And again, if we set up the tags correctly, you select this equipment and it'll correspond to who owns that equipment or who's renting it, the contractor here, and it'll automatically fill this out for you. So we want to be sure. Please revisit that original best practice on setting up your project with tags and to make it easier on your inspector and field engineer when they're doing diaries. And then finally, weather. So, weather self-explanatory. This is important to track rain days, to track workable days versus unworkable days. It's very important, self-explanatory. Make sure you're entering in your rain gauge reports. We did go over a rain gauge best practice, so I will not be going over that in detail. Please reference that if you do not know about that. But again, controlling pay item or pay items worked on for that day. Make sure we're inputting quantities. Make sure we're filling out all of this and especially the notes. Make sure you're calculating and make sure you're notating down all your assumption calculation, your assumption dimensions. Okay, moving to the journal. It's a very similar sentiment. Now, when I'm taking a look at this through the eyes of an engineer who is reviewing diaries to verify the work that was completed at the end of the month, or when we're negotiating for progress payments and when they are coming to request for payments. And obviously we have various different observations, journal observations. In the best practice, we go through some of these options that you have, but I can expand a little bit on what we've been seeing throughout the projects and what is super important. Now, obviously, providing images and videos is super important, but what we've seen being missed is corresponding to that image or video, we're missing these tags here. And again, tags are extremely important, and we need to be making sure that for any photo or for any observation that you make in your diary, that you tag it with the applicable tags. And the reason for this is at the end of the month, when we're coming through here, there's going to be, in some cases, and the diaries that I'm going through, there's going to be thousands of observations that you'll be going through for a month. So you can sit here and you can go through a journal or you can go through a report. And obviously the report will break it down by days, but sometimes you're looking for work and you weren't sure what day they completed that work. So you want to go through the entire journal observations and or spreadsheet observations. So what you'll do is you'll go through here and you'll utilize the filter system and you'll be able to go through a label and you'll be able to find, okay, what day did they work on the HMA pavement? So I can click here and then it'll it'll load here, and then it'll only filter for the HMA, for the observations that were tagged with this HMA pavement. So, not sure why it's taking a little bit to load. But the point is that making sure through our journal observations that we are tagging. A lot of times we've seen on diaries, people just take an image. Sometimes they write a little narrative next to it, and that is helpful. That is helpful, of course, but the tags are what are super important because we can always go back and reference. And let's say, let's say, somebody who's not involved with the project wants to come into Headlight and wants to go through your diaries and they want to filter for only specific pay item, then they're able to go here and do that. So right here, we're filtering for this pay item, and then we can sift from the hundreds of observations that was here, and then we can go through what observations had the tag here. And similarly, we can keep the same filter, and let's say, oh, well, now I want to take a look. Well, I see that the work was done here, so I'm going to verify that. But now I need to verify the quantity of what was done. So now I'm going to go to spreadsheets, and I'm going to see if I have the same filter on, albeit very slow this morning. It will automatically take it to spreadsheets, and it'll automatically filter for this HMA pay item that I have here. Obviously, if I'm going for a specific progress payment, I would go into a specific date range, and I could go from February to here. But in this case, I'm just going to filter for the pay item, and now I can see all of the quantities that were inputted and when it was installed, when it was completed. I can also see the assumptions in the calculations that were made so that when I go to, carry this over to the progress statement, there is justification for the calculation and for the actual amount being paid out. So I'm going to remove this filter. So I'm going to clear all the filters, get back to the overall project. So at the end of the day, we've gone through, or that is it for journal observations, spreadsheet observations. We've gone through previously. There are two options for how to create a journal report, a daily diary report. The first is to obviously go through here to create a project diary, then go from there to add your observations that you did for the day. But a more automated version is to just, add new and do the My Daily. So any observations that you made that day, it'll automatically be generated into that report, and then you can create your daily diary. And once it's here, double check it as an inspector field engineer, double check it to ensure that all of your observations that you made for that day are captured here. We want to be sure that a lot of times too, sometimes we're not titling the diaries. So we're just leaving it as the default, which would just be project diary 1, project diary 2. It's helpful if you can put the controlling work for that day in the title, so that when we, as engineers, or if you're going back and checking your diaries, that see a lot of times it's left as a project diary's default name here. But what is helpful is if we have the date, and then also the date will show up here as well. But what we have is the work, so that if I'm going back and trying to verify work, I can say, okay, well, where did we work on this? So we can do that through the journal, how I showed you previously, or we could do that through the daily report here. And once you're done, you want to go through, press submit. I already submitted this one. I'm just going to turn it back into draft so I can show the process. So once it's in draft, I checked all my observations, ready to go. So I'm going to hit submit. And I know we're only coming up on 3 minutes left, but the last point that I wanted to highlight here is throughout the COCOA review, we noticed that a lot of diaries were left unsubmitted. And the idealistic timeline for you is for you as an engineer or construction manager, project manager, to be approving these diaries is obviously, you know, at the very least at the end of the month, because obviously if you don't approve these diaries, they will not get carried over into the progress payment. So we need to make sure that we're at least doing it at the end of every month. But even better, if we're able to go at the end of the week, take a look at all the work that was done, get it approved. If there's adjustments needed, you can take a look at it at the end of the week, send it back to your inspector, have the inspector or field engineer revise their diaries per some of the recommendations, and through that, let's say that I wanted the inspector to go back and to edit it. What I would do is put it back into the draft phase, and you could even reject it. You can reject the diary, and then the inspector or field engineer or the creator of the form will have the ability to go back, change it from rejected to a draft, and then move forward with the process, resubmit it again, and have the engineer go through and approve it again. Again, the last thing I want to highlight is on a lot of the projects, when we went through all of your projects, not all, but for a lot of the projects, we are seeing that diaries are being left as submitted or being left as draft. We got to make sure that these diaries are going through its proper workflow and it is done in a timely manner, because obviously it affects your progress payments, and we need to be sure that we're approving and making sure that the work is verified at the very least each month. We need to make sure that that work is verified, because later on down the road, if we submit, if all these diaries are left in the submitted phase and it's 4, 5, 6 months later, you go back, you want to change a diary, you can change it, but you can't really tell the contractor to do anything at that point. It's too late, right? In most cases. So we need to be sure that we are properly reviewing these diaries and these submissions in a timely manner. So with that being said, I know this is still trying to load, but those are some of the best practices that I wanted to highlight as we went through Kokua, as we went through, as we're going through Headlight progress payments, Headlight change orders, and all of the updated features today. Are there any questions that you have before we end this meeting? I know it's already at 8, but are there any questions? Okay, if not, please if you think of questions later, please send your questions to econ@curacy.com. But thank you all for attending today. Have a great day. For those of you who have a holiday tomorrow, have a great long weekend. Thank you.